Welcome to our PowerPoint module for the week of October 5th, and this is our third and final week discussing racial inequality. And we're going to talk about a couple of articles that you read for this week that cover racial discrimination within the labor force. And then I also want to spend some time on a topic that many of you expressed interest in for obvious reasons because it's a very timely topic. I know you didn't have reading specifically on this, but I want to talk about race and policing and race and mass incarceration. I am going to have you watch a documentary on that in preparation for our classes on Wednesday and Friday, where we will spend more time discussing this topic. So to repeat, we're going to review readings on racial discrimination in the labor force, and then we're going to discuss racism, mass incarceration, and policing this week. I estimate that this module will actually take you a little bit longer than an hour, perhaps around an hour and a half, and that is because I do have you watching a documentary that is a little under an hour long. It is on a very important topic, so I do ask that you please watch the documentary and respond to the video question in preparation for further discussion in our class sessions. All right, so about an hour and a half this week. And here are your deliverables for this week. As usual, you have your reading question due Monday night, your PowerPoint module due Tuesday night, and you have an assignment due this Friday as well. You have your second film analysis due Friday by 11:59 p.m. If you have any questions on the film analysis, please let me know if you plan to attend office hours. That's a place where we can certainly discuss your film analysis, or we can set up another time to talk as well, okay? Instead of having you complete an opening question this week, I ask that you fill out a mid-semester check-in questionnaire, and this is available on Inquire. So here you can pause the PowerPoint module and complete the mid-semester check-in, and this is a way to check in on how our class is going. You're going to find questions specific to the PowerPoint modules, Zoom sessions, and for those of you who are now meeting in class, I have a couple questions on our in-class sessions as well. Okay, so pause here. Please respond to that questionnaire and then come back for the rest of the module. So I'm going to dive right into the first of the two articles that you read for this week. And this article is titled, "Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal?" Both of the articles you read for this week are investigating labor force discrimination by race. And in particular, this article was looking at the way in which names that signal race, so distinctively white-sounding names and distinctively black-sounding names, are associated with the number of callbacks that an applicant receives. And so they created a number of fake resumes with distinctive names that signaled race, randomly assigned qualifications, right? So in terms of education level, work experience, interests, skills, these were randomly assigned in order to make sure that the results were based on the race that's signaled by the names rather than differences of qualifications, right? So they randomly assigned those qualifications and then counted the number of callbacks, right? And on the next slide, you're going to see a bit of their results. So here's one table with some results from that study that I introduced in the previous slide and that you all read. And this is showing differences in callback rates based on what they call the racial soundingness of names. In other words, the first column is the percent callback for white names or names that sound white. And then the next column is the percent callback for names that sound African American or Black, but I would say more specifically African American. And then the next column is showing you the ratio, and that is dividing the percent callback for white sounding names by the percent callback for African American sounding names. And then at the very end, of the far side of the table, you see the percent difference p-value, So percent difference, and then also the p-value. This is something I'm not going to get into right now, but if you have taken a statistics course, you may know that the p-value signals statistical significance. So can we conclude here that we have a statistically significant difference? And if a p-value is under 0.05, typically that is the threshold that we use to determine statistical significance. All right, so under 0.05, significant difference. That's all I'm going to say about that. So what you see here, let's start with all sent resumes. So this is overall in the entire study, regardless of the place or like the city that they're looking at, regardless of the gender of the fake applicant, the type of job that the fake applicant is applying to. What kind of difference do we see by race or by the names that signal race? And you see that for white names, we have a 9.65% callback, compared to 6.45% for African American sounding names. And the ratio here shows us that those applicants with white sounding names on them actually had a 50% higher likelihood of a callback compared to those with African American sounding names. And we do have a significant difference here signaled by the p-value. They also looked at different cities. So here you see Chicago and Boston to look at regional differences in callback rates, and we do see some difference here if you just compare the percentages and the ratios. Ratios actually are pretty similar. But then we see for females, those in administrative jobs are hit the hardest, meaning that the callback rate for white-sounding names is 10.46% compared to 6.55% for black-sounding names. So that's a pretty big difference. We see a difference for males overall as well. So this is showing us that there are differences in the callback rates by race, and it does appear to span across place and also by gender. This counters assumptions that Black-white inequalities in employment are primarily driven by qualifications and socioeconomic status, right? Because the only thing here that's signaling race is names and not other differences. Now on to the second study that you read for this week. And this is Race, Crime, and Finding Work in an Era of Mass Incarceration. So what did the author, Diva Pager, do in this study? Similar to the previous study we discussed, this is a test of labor market discrimination, and the main difference here is that instead of using resumes, they actually sent out fake applicants, so applicants actually going to meet with potential employers. The other big difference here is that beyond looking at race, the researcher is also looking at a criminal record and whether or not there is some overlap between race and having a criminal record in shaping labor market discrimination and inequalities. So we have some fake job applicants. They only looked at men, so we have white men and black men who were randomly applying to entry-level positions, and these applicants were matched on other characteristics, such as age, self-presentation, obviously gender because we have all men here, and they were randomly assigned the presence or absence of a criminal record. And then the number of callbacks received by race and criminal record status were recorded. So here's what Pager finds in her research. She determines that a criminal record significantly negatively impacted the likelihood of a callback for all applicants. So before we even consider what happened by race here, we can consider how employment prospects for men with a criminal record is going to be especially detrimental for Black men who are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. But even more striking here is the comparison between Black and white men overall. Black men without a criminal record are less than half as likely to receive a callback than white men without a record. And beyond that, white men with a criminal record had slightly higher callback rates than Black men without a record. And this suggests that the presence or absence of a criminal record is certainly not the only driver of unequal employment opportunities for Black and white men. Rather, employers engage directly in employment discrimination by race. That's what we see with these baseline differences. And then the criminal record has a disproportionately negative impact for Black men. Now I want to switch gears and spend some time on race, mass incarceration, and policing. Because this is an important topic. It's a topic many of you expressed interest in, and it's also a very important topic to be talking about today. Um, so I want to start by showing you some statistics on racial differences in incarceration and how these do or do not reflect the overall adult population in the US. So here you see on the left side of the slide that Black and Hispanic people do make up larger shares of prisoners in the US compared to whites. Whites make up 64% of the US population, but 30% of the prison population. Whereas you see that Black individuals make up 12% of the US population, adult population, but 33% of the US prison population. So there clearly is a difference here. And we could pose a number of questions regarding why we see the overrepresentation of Black individuals in the US prison population. Do we see these disparities because they reflect racial differences in crime rates? This is a question that has long been asked. Do they reflect racial disparities in neighborhood or economic conditions that in turn shape crime? So are there majority-minority neighborhoods that are more impoverished, and then this contributes to higher crime rates in those neighborhoods? Or perhaps these disparities are the product of racial profiling by police, which leads to more frequent stops, searches, arrests, and so on. Or we could consider courts and sentencing. Perhaps there is racial discrimination in our court system, and this is leading to higher rates of sentencing for crimes among Black individuals compared to whites. So these are different questions, somewhat overlapping, but different questions. And I do not have an answer for all of these because we can't really consider any in isolation from the others. We can't point to one thing to understand racial inequalities in incarceration. Because when we start to point to a single cause, we lose sight of the bigger structural issues that are at play. We have overlapping systems of inequality that are operating together to shape differences in incarceration rates by race. For example, we need to consider the stark racial and ethnic disparities in wealth and poverty, differences or disparities in neighborhood environments, in educational opportunity, and then also consider disparities in the treatment by police and within the criminal justice system. There is no one thing or evil that we can point to in order to explain why we see the disparities that we see. And that is one big takeaway I want you to have from our discussions this week. I'm going to narrow this discussion down, even though we can't pinpoint only one thing. We're going to focus a bit more on policing. So as I said, we're going to devote some more time to policing and race, but I do want you to also be considering other interlocking systems, institutions, social issues that are combining with our policing in order to shape the racial disparities in incarceration that we see, a number of other outcomes as well. This is a figure from the Pew Research Center, and this is showing the percentage of Black women and men who say that they have been treated differently on the basis of their race. And I want to direct you to the second to last item on this figure. This is being unfairly stopped by police. You'll see here that 59%, and that is a lot, 59% of Black men say that they have been unfairly stopped. This is compared to 31% of Black women. And we don't have white people on this figure, but they would likely report a lower percentage than Black men and Black women. This is self-report. So you may be asking, do we assume that this is the truth? My inclination is to say yes, but I want to give you some more insight on this so that you can make an informed decision on the presence of racism in policing. Okay, so that's why we're going to spend the rest of this module watching a documentary, and you will respond to a question based on that documentary. Here is your video question, and this is based on an entire documentary that is nearly an hour long, okay? So I do want you to be taking notes other than just responding to this question. Take notes as you watch. Here's the video question that I want you to answer on Inquire, though. You're going to be watching something called Policing the Police 2020. This is a Frontline documentary. This is an update of a Policing the Police episode that they did several years ago. I want to say 2015, 2016. So you're going to watch that. Your question is to describe the reforms that the Newark Police Department has made since 2015. Have these reforms been successful? What other reforms might they consider? So you're going to see an up-close look at the Newark Police Department specifically in this documentary. I do want to note that this documentary addresses distressing themes. For example, in the first couple of minutes of the documentary, you do hear audio of George Floyd's murder, okay? And I know that it is distressing to hear, though I know that many of us have already heard it. I expect that this is going to be a little bit of, an uncomfortable watch for many of you. If you want to discuss this further before watching the documentary, or if you really are not comfortable with watching, just please let me know. But I do think that this is an important issue to learn about. And sometimes that does mean there's discomfort that goes along with that. All right, so I'm going to ask you to pause here, watch the documentary, answer this video question, and then there's only one more slide after this to briefly introduce what we're going to do in class. For class this week, we're going to do the same thing we've done the past couple of weeks. We'll have our in-class group meeting on Wednesday. We'll have our Zoom group meeting on Friday during our usual class time. And I want to spend the majority of our class time talking about race and policing in the US. We can, of course, talk about the readings as well. We can talk about other topics that are of interest to you, but I do want to focus on race and policing. Please do come prepared to discuss, all right? And that means watching the documentary. That means coming in with your own thoughts on this topic, okay? So I will see you in class this week.